With the threat of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs hanging over Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is convening a Canada-U.S. economic summit this Friday. The goal is to hear from key stakeholders in business how to make this economy more tariff-proof. One of the ways is making trade within Canada a whole lot easier, something the Trudeau government and premiers spoke about virtually today.
The provinces and territories are at the table with enthusiasm in a way that has not occurred over the past number of decades.
The federal government is committed to us that they'll knock off as many barriers as possible. We'll do the same, and every other province will do the same.
There's a real buy-in right now, including from the federal government, to make some progress here.
The point I'm trying to make is that we are at a pivotal moment in the history of our country and in the future of the Canadian economy.
Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist because the Power Panel is here. And here with me in the studio, Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. And Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. We just threw you up there, Amanda, and expected everyone to know exactly what was happening. So let's start
with her.
Yeah, let's start. I mean, look, the interprovincial trade conversation is going to get a bit of momentum. This is something premiers have been talking about for decades without a tremendous amount of change. So things have obviously gotten some urgency on that front. I just wonder, even with the pause, how do you see this whole issue just driving the political conversation in the country for the next, between now and the 4th of March? Because even in the Ontario election today, when Doug Ford was asked about other things, he pivoted back to tariffs. Where do you think this leaves us in terms of political conversation and policy choices?
Right. And obviously, because this is top of mind, and we've seen this issue, Trump tariffs is now like a top 3 issue for Canadians when they list the things that matter most to them. So there's no doubt that this is the topic that everyone wants to be talking about. What I like about what's happening, and you saw that there was enthusiasm when Anita Anand spoke today, such a loss that she's leaving cabinet because she's so good, but her enthusiasm was really around this idea of unity, that she has, the premiers are at the table. Now we're going to bring business and trade leaders to the table. And we're removing barriers that arguably could have and should have been removed a long time ago, right? Unlocking trade between provinces could reduce prices by 15%, could bring in $200 billion worth of trade amongst the provinces. And I think that for a lot of people who are skeptical about what government can do or the relationship between the provinces and the feds, how fractured that has felt, and so things have felt really stalled and stymied, this has the upside to what has happened is that I think that there's this new notion that there can be a speed at which we can move, whether it's seeing the execution of the border security plan and how quickly that was moved into action, or how quickly the provinces came together with retaliatory measures that they could put in their toolkit to defend against the Trump tariffs, or if it's let's bring the country's best into a summit to talk about removing these barriers that have been in place, why. And at the same time, we have we have International Trade Minister Mary Ng, who completed another free trade deal with Ecuador today, this week, and also reminded Canadians that our free trade agreements allow businesses to access up to 50 markets, 50 nations. So I think that there's this renewed excitement and interest. And the last point I'll make is this, is that what we saw on social media coming out of these tariff conversations was, yes, a lot of fear and anxiety, but it was also a lot of coming together, the sharing of links, made in Canada, buy in Canada. There's a momentum there that if you can seize on that, we can turn the trajectory and, yes, pivot into a more Canadian-centric approach, which I think is obviously good for the country, and it's also good for unity.
You know, Tim, speaking with members of the current government, or at least for the next 30-odd days, until the leadership happens, they have a lot of context, obviously, with the former Biden administration, and even people, down there in the U.S., Democrats, they are at the point where it's like the relationship is forever changed. Like 4 years of this, it's not going to slingshot back, like things went kind of back to normal when Biden came in. So I don't know if that realization has seeped in completely yet, but it does underscore that it can't just be talk on fixing things internally this time.
Yeah, there's the political relationship, then there's the relationship with the people of the United States. And as I've said to a few people, I was in Rochester, New York this weekend at a hockey tournament, ironically at a place called the Tim Hortons Iceplex, and talking to the Americans that that.
Famous Brazilian-owned coffee chain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Talking to the Americans there at a personal level, at a very base level, most Americans are totally unaware of this. So yes, while policymakers may be changing the relationship, there's a whole reservoir, and yes, we have Canadian officials trying to tap into it. But that in and of itself is an important component of this relationship. I love what Minister Anand is saying, that this could be done in 30 days, and I wish and I hope that is true. To undo 150 years of practices, some have been undone already, is going to be tough to do. And then there's the legislative reality of this, right? Not to rain on the parade. You're going to have to go back to Parliament to undo a lot of these things because they're enshrined in different pieces of legislation. So how much can really be done in this 30-day period? Symbolism matters. Let's not get past this. We're in this cathartic moment of let's get together and do things. But we got to keep driving, and we got to keep this unity of purpose. And we have a couple of roadblocks ourselves along the way. The Liberal leadership being part of it. What will a new Liberal Prime Minister for however long be able to do in that period? Then probably an election. So 30 days is optimistic. We're probably looking at 6 months, though. Intent is a wonderful thing.
You know, the provincial governments have got to make the changes. Just thinking about like fish regulations back home.
Yeah, you have to do a whole bunch of statute changes.
Yeah, like fish gets landed at a wharf in Newfoundland, to be very granular for a second, it has to be processed in Newfoundland and Labrador. You take that barrier away, suddenly you've got plant jobs going to Nova Scotia and these sorts of things, right? So maybe it's more productive, but politically that's a nightmare. And this is an example of some of the reasons why it stays that way. But Jordan, you know, when Tim was gallivanting with the enemy down there at the hockey tournament, they may
we
not
did beat an American team, by the way. Canada go.
The people's trial will convene afterwards.
Exactly. The Monday morning, you saw on the big American networks, like the Today Show did 11 minutes on tariffs, right? So it started to seep into the consciousness. And I think the realization, certainly from what the Prime Minister said on Saturday night, was that America may not be a reliable partner anymore. That as their political leadership changes, the deals get torn up. That, I think, is a fundamental thing.
A huge shift. And of course, never in our modern history have we ever really contemplated that the country with which we're so entwined on security, on trade, culturally, on so many other things, would be hostile to us. And so everything is built with, in fact, the exact opposite in mind, that we can work together very closely and in a trusted relationship. So yeah, I do think we are gonna see that shift. And for sure, even if we see Trump bend on some of these things, he will never be a trustworthy partner. And so that means that for the next 4 years, America cannot be a trustworthy partner for Canada. And that's going to mean some serious changes here. And so I think that certainly the internal trade discussions, that is a sensible place to start, certainly. But there's a reason that these barriers still exist. And that's because it costs political pain in each region to dismantle them. So I'm not sure that the conversations are necessarily going to be easy. We've had an internal trade agreement since about 2017. It's still not fully implemented, that one, let alone all of the other barriers that people are talking about today. So while I think it's good that we're seeing some unanimity to bring people to the table around it, I think it may take a little longer than folks are thinking.
Well, that's always been the case, right, Sherelle? Because you know, politically it's been easier for premiers to blame the federal government for things. This is stuff they got to do. And if they're serious about this, and if it truly is this panacea of unlocking all this wealth, the time for kind of excuses and inaction at the subnational level is over, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing premiers seem to love more than blaming the federal government for things that are essentially their fault. And we've seen it with healthcare, we've seen it with trade, we've seen it with all kinds of things. Now that the lens has kind of been turned around on them to say, hey, this is something that we all actually need to work together to do, and you have to do your part and you have to pull your weight. I do think we will see some forward momentum. But as you said, the conversation is always going to shift back to Trump and the tariffs. And then that means that the focus is also going to shift back to, but what is the federal government going to do about this? And we heard from Alberta Premier Smith saying, what we need is a federal election to deal with this because, we need somebody with a mandate for 4 years to deal with Donald Trump. So any time that we have a moment to say, okay, let's focus on what the subnational governments will do. But we need a federal government that's going to do something even bigger and even broader. And that's always going to be kind of the linchpin for everything. Yeah,
it's Schrodinger's parliament, right? It either must be recalled so we can debate and pass legislation, or it must be dissolved so we can have an election. That's it. It is kind of where things are. And it is dissolved, obviously, a mandate in Ontario, where Doug Ford is having his election. I just wonder, though, if that, and if Trump pauses this in 30 days, and then there's a new Liberal leader, and then there's a federal election, there's urgency for now.
Yeah.
If Trump says, just kidding, does that urgency go away? I wonder. They still try to make these gains.
Well, I think that we can rely almost 100% on the fact that we will never know what Trump will do. So
Yes.
even if he says, we'll pause again for another X amount of time, we're all at his whim, right? And his whims are frequent and they're unexpected and they're unpredictable. So I do think that the country has had a big wake up call. And, in light of elections, certainly it's been top of mind and it's been advantageous for premiers like Ford to take advantage of this moment of time to say, I need this mandate. I need a 4-year mandate in order to be able to deny my original promise, which was to balance the budget by the end of my mandate. I need to have billions of dollars at my disposal. So I think that's worked for him. But I don't think that this conversation is going away. I think that if Trump makes another proclamation in 30 days, that we have another 60 days, the momentum will continue. I think the same would be true if he said it's another 12 months. I think that we've had the wake-up call, and it's important now that the country continues with the momentum we have to dismantle some of the barriers that have, denied us from having the internal trade that we all know will be good for the economy.
Tim, do you see it that way, that the uncertainty of Trump, which will last for another 1,400 and some odd days, will lead to a permanent urgency on this? Because often it falls away as other things move up.
No, I don't. I wish what Amanda was saying I believe to be true. I don't disbelieve Amanda, but I don't think the Canadian public, because of other things that are going to pop up in their lives, other challenges that are going to be. The healthcare crisis isn't going anywhere. The long-term healthcare crisis, these things aren't going anywhere. Donald Trump is occupying a lot of space. He is forcing us to be more united, and perhaps has done some good as a consequence of that. But you only need to look at, the pandemic. People's mind drifts at a certain point in time. Politicians drift at a certain point in time. You could describe this as being analogous to the first 6 months of the pandemic, where during the first 6 months of the pandemic, as we're nearing the 5th year, the 5th anniversary, people were really focused, but then it began to drift off because there were other things that had to be dealt with. If we can get a lot done in 6 months, that is wonderful. But we probably have the mindset collectively as a truth social posting. It'll hang out there for a while and then we'll move off.
But Jordan, all the Liberal leadership candidates are on this. Pierre Poilievre is on this. So like the other issues like healthcare that Tim rightly points out, you can link it back to that if you wanted to as a federal government, right? I mean, Chrystia Freeland, we'll talk about this in a little bit. She's even on forcing provinces to do things on credentialing, talking about clawing back transfer payments. I don't know if that would work under the Canada Health Act.
So did Stephen Harper in 2006.
Yeah, but Canada Health, if you don't credential nurses across provinces, I'm going to pull back your Canada Health transfers. I mean, I don't know how that complies with the Health Act. But I mean, is there a way for whoever emerges as the medium-term prime minister here to use that to keep the eye on the ball at the provincial level?
I mean, that's a really short-term proposition, I think. But yeah, I mean, look, there is a moment of unity because we have an external threat. And as long as that external threat is live, there'll be an opportunity for federal leadership to bring people together. But I think maybe like Tim, I'm a little bit skeptical about the depth of that collaboration. We've already seen fractures with Danielle Smith, at moments Francois Legault or Scott Moe, where people are looking for regional carve-outs. They're looking for things that are going to kind of drive wedges between provinces. And I think that stuff is actually very dangerous. So the concern that I would have over the long term is if we are in this time of external crisis with the threat of Trump, as time goes forward, do we actually get to a place where we are turning against ourselves regionally? And I think that that's a very high risk. And that's one of the biggest challenges the next prime minister is going to have.
Cheryl, quick last thought from you.
Well, I don't think about how much and how quickly Donald Trump is doing, that is having ripple effects throughout the entire world. So it's not just the Canada-U.S. border. There's things that he's doing to cut aid to, in other countries, and how he deals with people, migrants to his own country. Those are all going to have ripple effects on Canada. So even if it's not specifically the threat of tariffs, there are other things that we're going to have to deal with as a country because of Donald Trump for the next 4 years.
Look, the stuff happening at the U.S. government and the Treasury Department and USA with the child coders from Doge is that is, who knows where that's going to go. With the clock already ticking on the next U.S. tariff deadline, the Liberals are seeking advice on how to get the economy ready. The Prime Minister will gather business and political leaders for a Canada-U.S. economic summit this Friday. And despite Canada's decades of struggles on interprovincial trade, today, Minister of Internal Trade Anita Anand claimed the barriers could be knocked down in a month.
Provinces and territories are at the table with enthusiasm in a way that has not occurred over the past number of decades. We are at a pivotal moment in the history of our country and in the future of the Canadian economy.
In the meantime, Quebec Premier François Legault says the uncertainty over tariffs is poison for the economy and a dagger over our heads. For more, I'm joined by Quebec's Junior Economy Minister, Christopher Skeete. Christopher Skeete, welcome back to the show. It's good to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Your Premier said sometimes it's better to get bad news than to have uncertainty. Would 25% tariffs be better than uncertainty right now? How do you assess that?
Well, you know what? What we're noticing is that the uncertainty is really stifling investment. So a lot of companies are just holding their breath. And I think a lot of times we'd rather just be dealing with a problem because I'm confident we'd be able to fix it. But now here we have sort of all the disadvantages of having the 25% tariffs without actually any of the advantages of having them. So I have to say that the uncertainty is really disheartening, and it's a lot of, it's taking a lot of momentum out of our economy. Things were going well, investment was coming back with the interest rates being lower, and now people are sort of going a little bit more unsure as to what they're going to do next. So the uncertainty is really, really dangerous for the economy, and I think everybody's feeling that throughout the economy.
Right. At a certain point, the threat of a tariff becomes a tariff because it's a mental tariff and people just react as if it will be in place and hold off or invest elsewhere, right? This is the challenge the whole country faces. If it's going to be something on a cross-border business venture, maybe you put the investment in the United States. This is the risk the country's facing.
Well, there's definitely a little bit of that, but there's also the uncertainty of knowing, are we really going through this with a trusted trade partner? Is this really happening? I think there's a little bit of shock there. And so by the time we absorb actually what's being said, we're sort of changing gears. There's 25% tariffs on Saturday. They don't really happen on Tuesday like they're supposed to. Now we get 30 days more. It's hard not to see a negotiation tactic in all this, but at the same time, the uncertainty is just not healthy for our economy.
So Premier Legault says yesterday that talks on renegotiating NAFTA, CUSMA, USMCA, whatever you want to call it, they should start now instead of waiting until 2026. What's the advantage of getting that going now? Could that just bring the turmoil ahead, or does that bring certainty ahead? How do you view it?
Well, we want certainty as quickly as possible. And now if we're going to be edging towards renegotiating it, which is clearly a deal that he doesn't appreciate, even though he's the one that negotiated it, Donald Trump that is, I think maybe we should just rip off the Band-Aid and start talking about what it is that's bothering him. I think the longer we have this uncertainty, the worse it is for the economy. And I think the best thing that we could do is find out really what he wants, see if we're able to make an arrangement and move forward. But I'm not getting the sense that he wants to wait till the end of the agreement, which is in 2026.
But he has taken specific aim at dairy as something that he was frustrated with last time, and he's more frustrated with this time. It seems you've got a big dairy sector in your province that benefits from supply management. The language laws in your province are American companies have an issue with that. You'd be opening Quebec up to a little bit of risk there, even earlier, right?
Well, he did threaten 25% tariffs on everybody, on everything. So, I mean, I don't see a difference between us and anybody else. I think we're all in the crosshairs. But the idea is to say, what is it specifically that you're looking for? Is it something that we're willing to give? And let's get down to business. And I think when I think about my premier, who's a former businessman, a former CEO of an airline company, we just want to get this taken care of and see what it is that we can do to work together, because we do have deep ties to the U.S. market. We want to continue those ties. And now we have a partner that doesn't seem happy. So let's have that discussion.
Okay, but what about, you're right, the 25% tariffs, everyone's in the crosshairs on that one. The interprovincial trade conversation that's going on is a little bit different because, some analysis you're seeing, Quebec has a lot more exceptions than other provinces on things like language, for example. Are you, as a province and a government, open to loosening some of those to make this great interprovincial trade push that is happening now work to its maximum effect?
There's a lot of things being said about the fact that we have exceptions in Quebec, and you're right, we are one of the jurisdictions that has the most exceptions. But when I look at all the exceptions that we have, do they really have a high dollar amount, a high dollar value? If we remove some of these exceptions, are we really going to move the needle on interprovincial trade? That's not really what my focus is. My focus is on mutual recognition and harmonization. I think there's a lot more work to be done, like we have with the trucking pilot, to see how we can harmonize our legislation, facilitate the free flow of goods throughout the provinces, and see how we can make quick wins there. But yeah, Quebec has exceptions for language. I think most Quebecers agree with that, and I think most Canadians understand that if they want to work in Quebec, that they're going to have to learn French. I don't think that that's the biggest barrier. I think really what we have to work on as a country is the mutual recognition and harmonization.
Right. But if every province looks at their narrow and specific exceptions and says, well, it's not really going to move the needle on dollar amounts, and then it becomes, well, if they're not going to do it, I'm not going to do this, and then I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that. And it becomes a recipe for a bunch of the barriers staying in place, because that's been the challenge really over the decades where people talk about this, right?
Well, the data's not there. In fact, since 2018, since our government came into power, we've seen an increase in 34% in the trade interprovincially. So we're actually seeing a $51 billion increase in trade with the provinces. We have $172 billion worth of transactions that go cross-border between Quebec and the other provinces. So we're seeing an increase in trade that's been happening over the past couple of years. So we think that things are going in the right direction. And again, if you look at the dollar amounts, not just of our exceptions, everybody's exceptions, I would say that that's not the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit comes with harmonization and mutual recognition. If we can move that needle, if we can identify 5 to 10 sectors that are really critical, I think we can have a lot more productive conversations by looking at that. And I think the exceptions are basically the tree that are hiding the forest.
Okay, I want to ask you about pipelines, if I can, Minister Skeete, because there's been a renewed conversation about this. Daniel Smith and others pushing for the idea of let's rejuvenate some of these older oil pipeline projects to diversify trade markets for fossil fuels. Energy East was obviously very controversial in Quebec, and the Premier said today that the social license is probably still not there, but that he might be open to it, if I'm not mischaracterizing his position, should the social license get there. With Trump back, what is the bar? Like, what are the conditions for Quebec to have social license for a project like Energy East? What would the circumstances be where that project or a version of it could happen?
Well, that's a hypothetical, but I can tell you where Quebecers are right now. Right now, Quebecers, I believe you're right, there isn't that social acceptability to move forward on a project like that, but I think Quebecers will also look at the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is right now the oil is still flowing into the United States, and it's not being taxed at a level that is, they were saying that it was going to be 25% for other goods. He put it at 10%. There's a reason he put the tariff at 10%. It's because he knows he can't do without it. So I'm not sure that the risk of being able to sell the Americans is there. So there really hasn't been any change in the actual reality on the ground as of yet. But again, social acceptability is a big issue in Quebec, and there just isn't right now.
But the economic dependency remains, right? Even if there isn't a barrier in place right now or a tariff of any kind on the energy exports. So, I mean, if the big national project that everybody's having in all of these meetings is try to reduce dependency on the United States, where does this fit into it?
Well, again, if we look at the facts, David, right now, there isn't a barrier. They're able to export their oil adequately into the United States to a market that wants it. So right now, the facts on the ground haven't changed. Now, I agree, the context has changed, and we're going to be monitoring the social acceptability as we go forward. But again, I think there are a lot of other battles that we could be waging. Again, interprovincial trade, harmonization, mutual recognition, there's a lot of work to be done there. And Quebec is also looking to diversify its markets. We're looking at buying local, we're looking at going to Europe, and we're also looking at different initiatives that we can increase to help our businesses transform their economy so that they're less reliant on parts that are coming from the U.S., and so that we could produce more here. So there's a lot of other things that we could be doing right now that help us regardless of what happens with the tariffs. And then what happens later and how we'll deal with that, we'll take it one day at a time.
No, I completely understand that, but I guess just as a final question, Minister, I'm just trying to understand what would it take for there to be social acceptability in Quebec, because I'm not sure there are conditions where it gets over the bar of social acceptability. Am I misunderstanding that? Because it seems this is where the opposition to something like this is the strongest in the country.
I think you're right. This is one of the jurisdictions where we have the highest opposition. It's also the place where we have the greenest energy and the most green development of our industry. So, of course, the bar is higher in Quebec, and the social acceptability is not there at this time. I can't speculate as to what it would take to increase it, but I could tell you that we're not there right now. And also, again, I think it's important for your realtors to understand the facts on the ground haven't changed. Alberta is still able right now as we speak to send their oil to the United States to a willing consumer. So right now, there hasn't been any movement in the facts on the ground.
Okay. Christopher Skeete, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Anytime, David. Take care.